It was a regular Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of day where the city feels both alive and quiet, as if the hustle of politics was on pause for just a moment. But behind closed doors, a storm was brewing. Tom Homan, the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, had spent months gathering evidence, speaking with insiders, and conducting covert investigations. He was ready to do something he had never done before: expose the truth behind the judicial system's mysterious manipulations. Homan had been known for his unwavering stance on border security and his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement. However, his latest mission had nothing to do with immigration enforcement. This time, he was targeting a far more influential figure, Judge James Boasberg. Boasberg, an Obama-appointed judge who had worked on a series of controversial decisions regarding immigration policy, had been quietly under the radar for years. On the surface, he was a respected member of the judiciary, but there were whispers that something darker lurked beneath his legal robes. Rumors swirled that his rulings weren't based on law but were instead influenced by personal and political motivations. Tom Homan had had enough. With the mounting pressure of public distrust in the system, he had made it his mission to uncover the truth about Boasberg. After months of investigation, he had uncovered damning evidence that would rock the foundation of Boasberg's career. In a press conference at the National Press Club, Homan stood before a packed room, ready to make his move. "Today, I'm here to unmask Judge James Boasberg," he began, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that sent a ripple through the room. "The truth is finally out. The man we've trusted to uphold the law is compromised, and it's time for the American people to know why." As Homan revealed documents, emails, and testimonies, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The press snapped to attention, eager to dissect the revelations. The public's perception of Boasberg was about to change forever, and the storm that Homan had unleashed was only beginning to gain momentum. The following day, the headlines were everywhere. "Tom Homan unmasks Judge James Boasberg, the truth is finally out." The media storm was relentless. News outlets from across the country were analyzing the explosive revelations, and political pundits were engaged in heated debates about the implications for the judicial system. But what was it that Homan had uncovered? The documents he presented at the press conference were just the beginning of a much larger, deeper story. Homan had found a series of confidential communications between Boasberg and influential lobbying groups with ties to activist organizations. These groups had been pushing agendas that aligned closely with Boasberg's controversial rulings on immigration and border security. The emails detailed how these groups had been shaping decisions in Boasberg's courtroom, often guiding the judge's rulings on high-profile cases. One of the most shocking pieces of evidence was a series of meetings between Boasberg and top officials from an international advocacy group focused on dismantling the current immigration policies. These meetings had been kept secret, and the documents showed that Boasberg had accepted their proposals and worked behind the scenes to influence his court decisions in favor of their agenda. Homan also revealed that Boasberg had been receiving significant financial contributions from these same groups, under the guise of legal education funds and donations to judicial initiatives. These funds, though legally framed, had raised significant ethical concerns, suggesting that Boasberg's impartiality could have been compromised. As the information spread, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Conservative figures in the political sphere were calling for Boasberg's resignation. "This isn't just about one judge. It's about the integrity of the entire judicial system," said Senator William Harris, who had long been an outspoken critic of Boasberg's rulings. "If we allow judges to be bought and influenced by outside interests, then our entire system of justice is in jeopardy." But it wasn't just the right wing that was reacting. The left-wing media outlets were scrambling to defend Boasberg, trying to downplay the significance of the revelations. "There is no concrete proof that Judge Boasberg's decisions were influenced by these meetings," some anchors argued. "These allegations are just part of a larger narrative meant to undermine judicial independence." Yet despite the spin, there was no denying that the investigation had rattled the core of Washington's political machinery. The question on everyone's lips now was, what would happen next? Would Boasberg be able to weather the storm, or was his judicial career doomed? In the halls of Congress, calls for an immediate investigation into Boasberg's actions were gaining traction. Homan had made his move, but the road ahead was uncertain. Powerful people were already working behind the scenes to protect their own, and some were prepared to do whatever it took to discredit the whistleblower. But Homan had anticipated this. He knew this battle wouldn't be won in a single day. The fight was just beginning. As the pressure mounted, Tom Homan began to realize the full extent of the forces he had stirred up. The revelations about Judge Boasberg's alleged corruption and ties to powerful lobbying groups had ignited a firestorm, but it was far from over. Powerful political players, including some from within his own camp, began to push back. Late one night, as Homan sat in his office reviewing more documents, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from a trusted ally on Capitol Hill. Boasberg is about to strike back. Watch your back. They've got people coming for you. Homan didn't take the warning lightly. He'd seen the way the system worked, the way the powerful could manipulate the truth, smear their enemies, and erase any trace of wrongdoing. But he wasn't one to back down, especially when the integrity of the judicial system was at stake. Within hours, Boasberg's camp went on the offensive. The judge had issued a public statement, denouncing the accusations as baseless and politically motivated. I have always upheld the law with the utmost impartiality, Boasberg's statement read. These allegations are an attempt to undermine my reputation and the independence of the judiciary. I will continue to do my job, and I trust that the truth will prevail. But it wasn't just a statement that Boasberg's allies had released. The legal community, many of whom were in his corner, began a coordinated campaign to discredit Homan. Prominent attorneys, former judges, and legal analysts began appearing on news networks, casting doubt on Homan's character and his motivations. Some even questioned his own background, implying that Homan was using his position to settle old scores or advance a personal agenda. Tom Homan's credibility is not just in question, one former judge said on a Sunday morning talk show, it's completely absent. His accusations are nothing more than a smear campaign against a well-respected judge who has served this country with distinction. The media had now split into two distinct factions. On one side, the conservative outlets were doubling down, standing by Homan's revelations and calling for a full investigation into Boasberg's financial ties and judicial behavior. On the other side, the liberal press was framing Homan as a right-wing puppet trying to destroy a judge who had long been seen as a protector of civil rights. As the battle raged on, Homan received an unexpected visit. A former colleague, someone he trusted deeply from his days at ICE, showed up at his doorstep one evening, looking worried. They're trying to bury you, Tom, his friend said, handing him a folder filled with documents. They've already contacted some of your sources. Be careful what you say next. They've got people inside your circle. Homan glanced through the papers. Inside was a trail of shadowy figures, people connected to Boasberg's allies, and some who had previously worked with Homan but now seemed to be flipping sides. It was clear that the judge's network was vast, and they were tightening the noose. But Homan wasn't ready to back down. If anything, the walls closing in only made him more determined. He had one more bombshell left to drop, one that would finally expose the full extent of Boasberg's influence, and perhaps, for the first time, force the hands of Congress to act. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his footing as the storm swirled around him. But one thing was clear, the fight was only just beginning. It was early morning when Tom Homan received the call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, yet this time, it sounded different, almost anxious. It was his inside source from the Justice Department, someone who had been feeding him information for months. Tom, I've got something you need to see, the voice said, barely above a whisper. You're right. Boasberg's involvement goes deeper than you know. The evidence you've been holding is just the tip of the iceberg. What you're about to find will make the entire case explode. Homan's pulse quickened as he listened intently. His source explained that there were classified documents, evidence buried deep within the Justice Department's archives, which revealed that Judge James Boasberg had not only been meeting with advocacy groups but had also participated in high-level meetings with political figures, members of Congress and even lobbyists, who had influenced key rulings in favor of their corporate and political interests. What was even more shocking, however, was the presence of money laundering schemes tied to these meetings. These weren't just donations or gifts, they were bribes disguised as legal campaigns or educational funding, designed to sway court decisions in favor of the highest bidders. This was the evidence that Homan had been waiting for. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Homan's next move was critical. He couldn't release this evidence in the same way as before, it had to be handled carefully, carefully timed. So, after a tense night of preparation, Homan scheduled another press conference, one that would be bigger than the last. This time, he wasn't just revealing documents, he was preparing to bring down an entire web of corruption that reached the highest echelons of power. The day of the press conference arrived. The room was packed, and there was a palpable tension in the air. Reporters whispered among themselves, trying to guess what Homan had up his sleeve this time. He walked to the podium, his face resolute, his voice steady. The cameras clicked, the lights blinding. "I told you the truth would come out," Homan began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "And today, I'm here to show you just how deep the corruption runs. It's not just Judge James Boasberg we're talking about. This is about a judicial system being manipulated from the inside out. A system that is supposed to be impartial is instead a playground for the rich, the powerful, and the politically connected." Homan began revealing the classified documents, displaying a set of encrypted emails and financial records that exposed the full extent of Boasberg's dealings. As the images flashed on the screen behind him, the crowd gasped. The documents clearly showed how Boasberg had accepted multiple payments from anonymous sources tied to major corporations and political PACs, money funneled through shell companies, masked as philanthropic donations. And worse still, Boasberg's judicial rulings on critical immigration cases seemed to coincide directly with the timing of these payments. But that wasn't all. Homan revealed a secret meeting that had taken place between Boasberg and a group of high-powered lobbyists just weeks before a landmark ruling on immigration law. The lobbyists, as it turned out, had extensive ties to foreign business interests that stood to benefit from a more lenient immigration policy. Boasberg's influence over the case was undeniable, and it was clear that his decisions had been shaped by the money he received. The crowd was stunned into silence as the full scope of the scandal became apparent. This was not just about political bias or ethical breaches. It was about bribery, corruption, and the manipulation of the law to serve the interests of the few. But the most damning revelation came last. Homan unveiled a covert audio recording, a meeting between Boasberg and a major political donor, discussing how Boasberg's decisions could be shaped in exchange for future support in his judicial campaigns. The tape was crystal clear, and it sent shockwaves through the room. "This is it," Homan said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "This is the truth. The American people deserve to know that the very system meant to protect them has been compromised. The integrity of our judiciary is at stake, and we can no longer allow this to continue." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the questions started coming fast and furious. The room erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to get their stories, and the political fallout began to take shape. The media was in overdrive, and Boasberg's fate was sealed. Calls for his immediate resignation flooded in from both sides of the aisle, and within hours, a congressional inquiry was announced. But there was one thing Homan hadn't anticipated: the level of resistance he would face from within his own party. Powerful senators and influential figures, who had once praised his work in immigration enforcement, now began to distance themselves from him. They feared that his revelations might bring down more than just Boasberg, an unraveling of the system itself. As the storm raged around him, Tom Homan knew this was the moment of truth. His career, his reputation, and his future were now in jeopardy. But for him, it had never been about personal gain. It was about justice, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The aftermath of Homan's press conference was nothing short of chaotic. The scandal surrounding Judge James Boasberg had escalated into a full-blown political crisis. The media, both conservative and liberal, had latched onto the story, dissecting every detail and amplifying the fallout. Boasberg was no longer a respected judge, he was a symbol of the corruption that had infiltrated the judicial system. Calls for his resignation flooded in from across the political spectrum, and whispers of potential criminal investigations began to surface. But despite the growing chorus of outrage, there were those who stood ready to defend him. Powerful members of Congress, who had long benefited from Boasberg's rulings, began mounting a counteroffensive. Boasberg's legal team went on the attack, launching a campaign to discredit Homan. They insisted that the documents Homan had revealed were either fabricated or taken out of context. A smear campaign against Homan began to take shape, with anonymous sources leaking damaging rumors about his personal life and political connections. As the weeks dragged on, Homan found himself in the crosshairs of a political machine far more powerful than he had anticipated. It wasn't just Boasberg's allies who were trying to discredit him, his own political network began to turn against him. Behind closed doors, people he thought were allies quietly distanced themselves, worried about the repercussions of crossing powerful figures in the legal and political establishment. One afternoon, as Homan sat in his office, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was Senator William Harris, the same senator who had supported Homan's earlier efforts but had recently become silent on the issue of Boasberg. Harris closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Homan, his face grim. "Tom, I've got to be honest with you," Harris began, his voice low. "The pressure is mounting. Some of the people behind Boasberg are threatening to bring down anyone who tries to go after him. I've been approached by a lot of powerful people who want this whole thing to go away." Homan listened closely, sensing the weight of what Harris was about to say. "They're suggesting you back off," Harris continued, his eyes searching Homan's face. "This is bigger than you think. The people you've pissed off, well, they don't just control the courts. They control a lot more than that. If you push this any further, you're going to make enemies you can't fight." Homan's heart raced. He'd known there would be consequences, but hearing it from someone as plugged into the system as Harris made the stakes feel much more real. The senator looked at him, his face a mixture of concern and resignation. "You've already done enough," Harris said, standing up. "It's time to let someone else handle this." But Homan wasn't done. He'd come too far to back down now. He knew the system was broken, but he also knew that no one would fix it if people like him didn't stand up. "I'm not backing off, William," Homan replied, his voice hard. "I've been in this fight long enough to know how these people operate. But I'm not going to let them win. I can't." Harris's expression hardened, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in on them. The senator sighed, knowing that this conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in Homan's battle. The war was no longer just about Boasberg, it was about exposing the corruption that ran through the very veins of Washington. But the next phase of Homan's fight would not be easy. Behind the scenes, the political heavyweights were pulling every string they could to discredit him, to silence him, and to protect their interests. A quiet war had begun, and Tom Homan had just become the primary target. He wasn't going to back down, but he also knew that the more pressure he applied, the more desperate his enemies would become. He had to be strategic. He had to stay ahead of them. And most importantly, he had to make sure that the truth, his truth, would not be buried. The next day, the phone call came. It was from a journalist at a major news outlet, someone with ties to the highest levels of government. She had information, vital information, that could change everything. "The walls are closing in on Boasberg," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I've got a source who's ready to testify. He's been a part of Boasberg's network, and he's got everything, records, emails, and a full account of the illegal activities." Homan's heart raced as he listened. This was the break he needed. It was time to push even harder. With the evidence he had, and now this new source, he could finally bring down Boasberg, and, perhaps, the entire system that had protected him. The weight of the battle had never felt heavier. Tom Homan knew that the moment had come. The revelations about Judge Boasberg, once confined to documents and allegations, were about to be brought into the open in a way that could no longer be ignored. The new source, a former insider within Boasberg's inner circle, had promised to deliver what Homan needed to finish what he had started. This was the final step in bringing the truth into the light. The journalist who had contacted Homan had made good on her promise. She arranged a clandestine meeting in a dimly lit cafe in Georgetown, far away from the prying eyes of Washington's political elite. Homan arrived early, his mind racing with possibilities. If this source could deliver what he claimed, it could be the bombshell that would bring down not just Boasberg, but expose the entire corrupt network that had been manipulating the judicial system for years. When the source finally arrived, he was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in nondescript clothing, his face weary and guarded. He sat across from Homan, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a manila envelope on the table. "This is everything," the source said, his voice barely audible. "Emails, financial transactions, confidential court documents, everything that ties Boasberg to the lobbying groups and the bribery. I've seen it firsthand. I've been a part of it." Homan opened the envelope, carefully scanning the materials inside. The documents were more detailed than he had hoped. There were records of Boasberg's private meetings with key figures from the lobbying groups, dates, locations, and the subjects of their conversations. But it wasn't just the meetings that were damning, it was the money trails. There were wire transfers, offshore accounts, and arrangements for Boasberg's legal education funds that were, in reality, front operations for illicit financial transactions. "This is bigger than I thought," Homan muttered under his breath, the scope of the corruption sinking in. These weren't just isolated incidents, this was a full-scale operation to influence judicial decisions, to shape the law in favor of corporate interests, and to enrich the key players involved. Boasberg had been a willing participant, accepting payments for favorable rulings and even directing cases towards certain law firms that had paid for his allegiance. As Homan absorbed the evidence, he looked up at the source, whose eyes were now filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Why are you coming forward now?" Homan asked, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. The source hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I've seen too many good people hurt by the decisions Boasberg's made. I can't live with myself knowing what I've helped cover up. But I'm scared. I've already had people come after me. If they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done." Homan nodded, understanding the weight of the man's decision. Coming forward meant risking everything, his career, his freedom, and perhaps even his life. But it was also the only way to ensure that the truth was exposed. "Don't worry," Homan reassured him. "I'll protect you. You've done the right thing." With the documents in hand, Homan knew he was ready. The final push had arrived. But he also understood that this would be the most dangerous phase of the fight. The powerful forces behind Boasberg weren't going to sit idly by. They would do everything they could to silence Homan, to discredit him, and to bury the truth. The next day, Homan arranged for a public release of the documents. A well-coordinated press conference was scheduled, and the media was already buzzing in anticipation. But this time, it wasn't just Homan alone at the podium. He had secured the testimony of the whistleblower, the insider who would back up every claim with first-hand knowledge. The stage was set for the final confrontation. But even as the preparations for the press conference were underway, the opposition was already plotting its counterattack. Boasberg's allies, still reeling from the damage Homan had already done, were prepared to do whatever it took to crush him. And this time, they were playing for keeps. As Homan stood backstage, preparing for the biggest moment of his career, a chilling thought crossed his mind: what if the truth wasn't enough? What if the system, the very system he had been fighting to protect, was too corrupt to fix? But there was no turning back now. He had come too far. The press conference began. Homan stepped into the spotlight, his face calm but determined. The world was watching. "This is it," Homan began, his voice carrying through the room. Everything you've been told about Judge James Boasberg is about to change. Today, I'm here to show you that the system we've trusted has been compromised. What we've uncovered is not just about one judge, it's about the corruption that infects the heart of Washington. As he unveiled the documents and played the source's recorded testimony, the room was gripped by the magnitude of the revelations. The tapes were damning, Boasberg's own voice, discussing how he had been influenced by money and power, discussing deals made in the backrooms of Washington. The evidence was undeniable. The room erupted into chaos as reporters demanded answers. But the battle was far from over. The forces fighting to protect Boasberg were already moving in the shadows, and Homan knew that his fight was only just beginning. The media storm that followed Tom Homan's press conference was unlike anything Washington had ever witnessed. The documents, the audio recordings, the testimonies, everything was out in the open. Judge James Boasberg's once stellar reputation was shattered beyond repair. Yet, even as the truth poured into the public eye, the battle for justice had only begun. The following days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and intense media scrutiny. Homan found himself at the center of a political firefight. On one hand, the public was clamoring for Boasberg to be removed from the bench, while on the other, the powerful figures who had supported Boasberg for years were doubling down, determined to keep the scandal from spiraling further out of control. Senator William Harris, who had tried to warn Homan about the dangers of pushing too hard, reached out once more. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "You did it, Tom," Harris said, his tone a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You've exposed a truth that no one wanted to admit. But you're also making some very powerful enemies. They won't stop. They'll try to destroy you, your career, your life. You've poked a hole in the entire system." Homan understood. The stakes had escalated beyond just a judicial scandal. It was now about dismantling a corrupt network that had woven itself into the very fabric of Washington's power structure. He had threatened the status quo, and the people invested in that status quo weren't going to let him walk away easily. As the pressure mounted, the retaliation came in waves. Homan's personal life was scrutinized, his past was dug up, and smear campaigns aimed at discrediting his credibility flooded the media. Some tried to label him a political hack, while others accused him of being a pawn in a larger, right-wing agenda. But it didn't matter. Homan knew the truth, and he knew he had to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, Boasberg remained defiant. In a public appearance, he continued to deny any wrongdoing, maintaining that he had always acted with the highest integrity. But his deflections were growing weaker with each passing day. His financial backers, who had once seen him as an invaluable ally, began to distance themselves, and even members of his own family were publicly urging him to step down. It was clear that Boasberg's days on the bench were numbered. But Homan wasn't looking for Boasberg's resignation alone. He wanted accountability. He wanted the entire system to be overhauled. His goal had never been about destroying one man, it had been about exposing the rot at the core of the judicial system and demanding reform. As Boasberg's defenses crumbled, a new investigation was launched. The Department of Justice, prompted by the public outcry, began to review Boasberg's cases with a fine-tooth comb. The tide was turning. In a dramatic, almost poetic moment, as the weight of the revelations continued to ripple through the halls of Congress and the media, Boasberg's resignation was announced. But the damage was already done. The public trust in the judicial system had been irrevocably shaken. And while Boasberg's career had ended, the work was far from over. In the months that followed, Homan's relentless pursuit of truth began to yield broader changes. Congress, under pressure from both sides of the aisle, passed sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency and oversight within the judiciary. There was talk of a new, independent body to monitor judicial conduct and financial transactions. The system that had once protected the corrupt was now in the process of a major overhaul. As for Homan, his career had been forever changed. He had become a symbol of resilience and integrity. But he also knew that the war he had waged against corruption within the system had come at a cost. The personal attacks, the threats, and the constant pressure had taken a toll. He had exposed the truth, but at what price? In the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the chaos, Homan often found himself reflecting on the journey. The fight for justice, he realized, was never easy. It was a battle of endurance, where the cost of victory was often measured in sacrifices. But as he watched the nation begin to grapple with the changes, he knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. The truth had been exposed. The system had been rocked to its core. And while the battle was far from over, Homan had won the war.